I don't know about you, but I find personally speaking that a lot of times when it comes to Easter and the Easter season in general, a lot of times it's really difficult to talk about these things because the primary subject is the resurrection. I mean, even though it sounds kind of weird, it's almost easier in a certain sense to talk about Palm Sunday, for example, or Good Friday, because the primary subject there is like suffering and death, and we know these things through our own kind of personal experience. But again, more to the point, when it comes to the resurrection, not too much to say. As a result of which Easter is sometimes reduced to empty platitudes. Thank you, Lord, for your victory over sin and death, and we look forward to the resurrection of the dead at some point in the future, which again rings kind of hollow in a certain sense. And so given all that, I thought perhaps a more accessible way to talk about Easter and the resurrection is to reflect upon this really great animated film which came out in 1998 called The Prince of Egypt. So The Prince of Egypt is basically about the story of the Exodus, as you hear in the book of Exodus. And so, as you might recall, the Israeli people, they're in slavery in Egypt for the longest time. And Pharaoh, as you hear in the book of Exodus, he ultimately decides at the time of Moses that the Israelite people are growing too fast in number, as a result of which he orders the death of the Israelite children. And so as a result, Moses' mother, when Moses is still a baby, puts Moses into this wicker basket and floats him down the river Nile. But then Pharaoh's daughter ultimately discovers him in the river, rescues him from the water, and then raises him as her own, right? As a result of which Moses becomes a prince of Egypt, hence the title of the movie. But then eventually, as you might recall, Moses rediscovers his Israelite heritage. He encounters the Lord in the context of the burning bush, and that same Lord sends him forth on a mission. Go to Pharaoh and demand that he let my people go, which of course Moses does. But of course, initially, Pharaoh doesn't let the holy people of God go, but instead increases their workload as a result of Moses' failed overture. And so this gives rise to what I think is probably the best scene in the entire film. And so again, Moses has just left the palace, and he's wallowing in his failure. And by this time, again, the people of God, they know what's happened. Here's this guy who has tried and failed to set us free. And now, as a result of his failure, our workload has been increased. And so, obviously, they're mad. And so one of them throws mud on his face, it hits him in the face, and he falls down, and he's in the mud. He's literally in the mud, symbolic of his shame. And then Aaron, Moses' brother, comes up, and he starts rubbing his face in it, rubbing his face in his shame on behalf of the holy people of God. And then Moses' sister, Miriam, shows up. And then Moses, like he's still in the mud, he looks at his sister. And he says, Miriam, I'm so sorry. And then Miriam looks at him, and she's the embodiment of compassion and mercy and hope. And she says, Moses, I've been a slave all my life. And God has never answered my prayers until now. God has saved you from the water. He has saved you from all your wanderings. And even now he saves you from the wrath of Pharaoh. Because of course Pharaoh could have killed him, but he didn't. So then Miriam concludes, God has never given up on you, so don't you give up on us. And just the way the movie is shot, you can tell that something in Moses' heart changes at that point. And so he looks at Aaron, he looks at the holy people of God, and he finds within his heart hope and courage to try again. And so he picks himself up out of the mud, and he does precisely that. He tries again, and then eventually, of course, he is instrumental in terms of setting the holy people of God free. Now, obviously, it's a beautiful scene, but I want to make sure you get the appropriate takeaway message, right? And so, in a certain sense, what Miriam is saying to Moses at this particular moment is like, look, I know you're looking at yourself right now, and all you can see is your failure, your weakness, your sin, and your shame, but that's only part of your story. The fullness of your story is the story of salvation. Salvation that God is bringing about in your life, a story which is ongoing and is destined for victory. And so, yeah, given all that, don't give up on us, and don't you dare give up on yourself. Because what God has begun in time, he will ultimately bring to completion. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And this is kind of a personal story, so I'm going to change the facts a little bit to protect the innocent. So suffice to say that a long time ago, I was having dinner with a priest friend of mine, and we were talking about ministry. Now, this probably goes without saying, but perhaps not. But in any case, when it comes to priest friends, we don't typically see each other do ministry. And so, for example, I don't typically see my priest friends do their thing on Sundays because I'm typically doing my own thing on Sundays. So in this case, for my priest friend to share with me his experience of the Sunday weekend was kind of interesting. And in particular, he was talking about preaching. And something which really kind of struck me was the level of formality and rigidity that he was kind of bringing to bear when it came to preaching, which seemed really notable because my friend is typically very relaxed and friendly and all these different things. And so we ended up talking about for hours, actually, talking about such things as psychological wounds, emotional issues, family issues, daddy issues, even past experiences with priests in mentorship positions from the past. And the recurring theme was this notion of shame. And funny enough, this expression, if only. If only I wasn't hurt in this way. If only I wasn't rejected in this way. If only I had been loved in the way that I wanted to be loved, in the way that I needed to be loved, perhaps things would be different. Perhaps I would be confident. Perhaps I wouldn't be so afraid. And perhaps I could preach and speak and do ministry from that place. And then perhaps I could be a good priest. So that's what our conversation basically amounted to. In response to which I basically said to him, buddy, I hear what you're saying in terms of looking back in your past and wondering, what if, and asking yourself if only, right? But I want to suggest to you that your story is not simply what your wounded heart tells you. Your story, harkening back to what we said earlier, is a story of God's victory in you. And what's more, even though you have a sense of regret in terms of if only I was different, then I could be like a good priest, the reverse is actually true. Because the reality is that if you learn to have the courage to speak and preach and minister from that place of weakness, funny enough, that's what the people of God want to hear. That's what they need to hear. And again, if you preach and speak and minister from that place, that's what's going to make you an excellent priest. And if you think about it, shades from that scene from the Prince of Egypt, right? Because if you think back to the whole episode, especially involving Aaron and the people of God, you can certainly look at it historically and literally, but you can also look at it psychologically, right? Because in a certain sense, Aaron, when he's basically speaking these words of condemnation to Moses in that particular scene, he represents Moses' wounded self. And so in a certain sense, the scene speaks to the fact that an important prerequisite for Moses to become the prophet that he's meant to be, he needs to reconcile himself with his wounded past, to recognize that an important prerequisite to receiving and being thankful for God's victory in you, you need to recognize where you came from. You need to recognize that every saint had a past, and every sinner, without exception, has a future. So regardless of who you are or what your particular circumstance might be, you are invited, and indeed in a certain sense commanded, to look forward to that which is to come, to look forward with a sense of joyful expectation in terms of the fullness of God's victory being brought about in you. And may God bless you all.